At the peak of his power, billionaire Richard Vaughan thought he had buried his darkest secret, the son he left to die. But at a grand charity gala, his past walks through the door. Daniel Chen has survived, and he's here for answers. This time, Richard can't run. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Richard Vaughan stood at his office window, staring at the city lights below. Everything in his world was perfect, exactly as he'd planned. His company was worth billions. His name appeared in every business magazine. He had the biggest house, the fastest car, the most beautiful wife. But now, one small problem threatened to ruin it all. "Mr. Vaughan," his secretary's voice came through the intercom. "The hospital is calling again about Daniel." Richard's jaw tightened. His 4-year-old son. The doctors had called 3 times today with the same news. Daniel's cancer was getting worse. They needed decisions about treatment. They needed more tests. They needed. "Tell them I'm in a meeting," he said, but the calls kept coming. His wife Sandra wouldn't stop crying. The nurses wanted to know when he'd visit. Everyone wanted something from him, and Richard Vaughan wasn't used to feeling helpless. That night, he stood in Daniel's hospital room, watching the little boy sleep. Medical machines beeped quietly. IV tubes snaked from Daniel's tiny arm. His brown curls, just like Richard's own, had started falling out from the chemotherapy. "Mr. Vaughan," a nurse said softly from the doorway, "we need to discuss the new treatment plan. The doctor thinks—" "Stop!" Richard cut her off. He'd made his decision. "Get his clothes and whatever he needs for discharge. I'm taking him home." The nurse's eyes widened. "Sir, that's not advisable. Daniel needs—" "I'm his father. I know what he needs." The nurse tried to argue, but Richard was already signing the papers. Against medical advice, they said. He didn't care. He had a plan. An hour later, Richard drove his Mercedes down a dark highway, far from the city. Daniel slept peacefully in the back seat, wrapped in his favorite blue blanket. He didn't stir when Richard pulled onto a quiet country road. "This is better," Richard whispered, more to himself than to his sleeping son. "You won't suffer now. It's kinder this way." He parked the car on the side of the road beneath tall oak trees. For a moment, he watched Daniel's peaceful face in the rearview mirror. Then he got out, leaving the keys in the ignition. "Someone will find you," he said. "They'll take better care of you than I can." Richard started walking. He didn't look back, even when the distance grew so great that the car disappeared into the darkness. By morning, he was back in the city. By noon, he'd called the police to report his car stolen, with his sick son inside. The search lasted weeks. Richard played his part perfectly, the devastated father, too overcome with grief to speak to reporters. Sandra screamed and cried, begging him to keep looking. But Richard knew better. A sick little boy alone in the cold, nature would be merciful. "Quick, we have to accept it," he told Sandra months later when she couldn't stop crying. Daniel's gone, but Richard had already accepted. It had chosen it. His perfect life could continue now, unburdened. No more hospitals, no more decisions, no more watching his son suffer. Years passed. Sandra eventually left him, unable to bear the weight of their loss. Richard barely noticed. He threw himself into his work, building his empire higher and higher. Sometimes late at night, he'd remember Daniel's smile, his laugh, the way he'd reach for Richard's hand. But those memories grew fainter with time, like old photographs left in the sun. 20 years passed this way. Richard's hair turned grey at the temples. His fortune tripled. He remarried twice, though neither marriage lasted. People called him brilliant, ruthless, unstoppable. No one remembered he'd once had a son. Then came the night of the charity gala. Richard stood at the podium in his $1,000 tuxedo, accepting praise for his generous donation to the children's cancer ward. The irony didn't even occur to him anymore. Mr. Vaughan's dedication to fighting childhood cancer is an inspiration, the hospital director announced. His $10 million donation will help countless families facing this terrible disease. Richard smiled for the cameras, shook hands, accepted congratulations. This was his world now, perfect, controlled. Nothing could touch him here. Then a young doctor stepped forward from the crowd. He was tall, handsome, with familiar brown curls and eyes that Richard hadn't seen in 20 years. "Father," the young man said quietly, "do you remember me?" The champagne glass slipped from Richard's hand, shattering on the marble floor. The sound echoed through the suddenly silent ballroom. Richard stared at the young doctor, his heart pounding. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. But there was no denying those eyes, that face. The little boy he'd left alone in the dark had somehow survived. Daniel had come home. The night Richard Vaughan abandoned his son, Martha Chen was driving home from her late shift at the diner. She'd been a nurse once, back in her younger days, but life had other plans. Her husband's death had left her with bills to pay, and the diner job kept food on the table. She almost missed the Mercedes parked on the dark road. Something made her slow down, though. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was God's hand. Either way, Martha pulled over. "Hello?" she called out, approaching the car carefully. "Is anyone there?" That's when she heard it. Soft crying from the back seat. Martha's heart nearly stopped when she saw the little boy tangled in his blue blanket, tears running down his face. "Where's my daddy?" Daniel asked, his voice shaking. Martha looked around. There was no one else in sight. Just trees, darkness, and a sick little boy left alone to die. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said, though nothing about this was okay. "I'm going to help you." She called the police right away. They came quickly, lights flashing in the darkness. Martha held Daniel's hand while he told them what he could, which wasn't much. He was only 4, scared and sick. The father reported the car stolen, one officer said quietly to his partner. Said his son was inside. Martha's blood boiled. She'd seen the designer clothes Daniel wore, the expensive car. Someone had left this child here on purpose. At the hospital, the doctors discovered how sick Daniel really was. Cancer, they said. Advanced. He needed treatment right away. "I'll stay with him," Martha told the social worker. "Just until they find his family." But Martha knew what kind of person would leave a sick child alone in the dark. She'd seen enough of life's cruelty to recognize it. Days turned into weeks. Martha came to the hospital every day after her shift, bringing books and toys. She read to Daniel, held his hand through the treatments, and prayed harder than she'd ever prayed before. "You're a fighter," she told him when the chemotherapy made him sick. "God didn't lead me to you just to let you go." The police investigation hit dead ends. Richard Vaughan had played his part well, the grieving father too distraught to answer questions. His wife Sandra couldn't stop crying long enough to help. The detectives eventually moved on to other cases. Martha didn't care. She had more important things to worry about, like making Daniel eat his lunch or helping him build pillow forts in his hospital room. "Can I call you Mama?" Daniel asked one night, his small hand holding hers while they watched cartoons. Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Of course you can, sweet boy." The adoption papers came through 6 months later. By then, Daniel's cancer was in remission. The doctors called it a miracle. Martha called it love. They moved to a small town in Pennsylvania, far from the headlines about the missing Vaughan heir. Martha took nursing classes at night to renew her license, working days at the local clinic. It wasn't easy, but they made it work. Daniel grew stronger every day. The scared little boy became a curious child, always, asking questions. He loved science and helping people. When he was 7, he announced he wanted to be a doctor. "Like the ones who made me better," he explained. Martha encouraged his dreams. She worked extra shifts to buy him science books and chemistry sets, their small apartment filled with his experiments and awards from school science fairs. But sometimes, late at night, Daniel would have nightmares about being alone in the dark. Martha would hold him close, singing old Chinese lullabies her mother had taught her. "Why didn't he want me, Mama?" Daniel asked once after a particularly bad dream. "Some people aren't strong enough to handle love," Martha told him. "It wasn't about you, sweet boy. It was about his weakness, not yours." As Daniel grew older, the nightmares came less often. He threw himself into his studies, graduating high school at 16. When the acceptance letter from Harvard Medical School came, Martha cried happy tears. "Your birth father may have left you," she said at his graduation, "but God made sure you had the right mother all along." Daniel hugged her tight. "You're the only parent I need." But Martha knew her son. She saw how he sometimes stared at old newspaper clippings about Richard Vaughan. She noticed how he tracked his birth father's career, his charity work, his public appearances. "It's okay to want answers," she told him one night during his residency. "It's okay to wonder." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "I don't wonder anymore," he said finally. "I know exactly who he is. What I don't know is if he's capable of change." Martha watched her son become one of the youngest pediatric oncologists in the country. She saw how he worked tirelessly with sick children, how he never gave up on even the hardest cases. "Every child deserves someone who'll fight for them," he would say. Then came the invitation to the charity gala. Martha saw it on Daniel's kitchen counter during one of her visits. "The hospital's receiving a big donation," Daniel explained. "From Richard Vaughan." Martha's heart skipped a beat. "Are you going?" Daniel nodded slowly. "I think it's time." "Do you want me to come with you?" He smiled, the same brave smile she'd first seen in a dark car 20 years ago. "No, Mama, this is something I need to do alone." The night of the gala, Martha sat in her apartment, clutching her rosary beads. She prayed not for justice or revenge, but for peace, for both her son and the man who had thrown him away. "Guide him, Lord," she whispered. "Whatever happens tonight, guide my boy home." Hours later, her phone rang. It was Daniel. "He recognized me, Mama," he said softly. "You should have seen his face." Martha closed her eyes, tears rolling down her cheeks. Her son had survived abandonment, cancer, and heartbreak. He'd grown into a man any parent would be proud of. And now, 20 years later, he was about to teach his birth father the true meaning of strength. The silence in the grand ballroom lasted only seconds, but to Richard Vaughan, it felt like years. Hundreds of eyes watched as he stared at the son he'd left for dead. Camera flashes went off like lightning. Somewhere, a woman gasped. "Security," Richard managed to say, his voice shaking. "Get this man out of here." But Daniel stood his ground. "You won't get rid of me that easily this time," he said. "Not like you did on that road 20 years ago." The crowd erupted in whispers. Richard's current wife, Victoria, grabbed his arm. "Richard, what is he talking about?" Before Richard could answer, Daniel pulled out the old photograph. "This was taken 2 weeks before you abandoned me," he said, holding it up. "Before you decided a sick child didn't fit into your perfect life." More gasps, more camera flashes. Richard felt the carefully built walls of his life starting to crumble. "You're lying," he said, but his voice had no strength. "My son died. The car was stolen." "Was it?" Daniel's voice carried through the ballroom. "Or did you park it on Old Mill Road, leave the keys in the ignition and walk away? Did you even look back once?" Victoria's hand fell from Richard's arm. She took a step back, horror spreading across her face. "Richard," she whispered, "tell me he's lying. Tell me you didn't—" But Richard couldn't speak. The truth he'd buried for 20 years was rising up, threatening to drown him. Margaret Fuller, his biggest business rival, stepped forward from the crowd. "Dr. Daniel Chen," she said, looking at the young doctor. "Of course, I should have seen it before. You're the rising star in pediatric oncology, the one who never gives up on his patients." Daniel nodded. "Every child deserves someone who'll fight for them. I learned that from my real parent, the woman who found me that night and saved my life." The hospital director looked like he might faint. The press were already rushing to their phones, calling in the biggest story of the year. Richard Vaughan, celebrated philanthropist, exposed as a man who'd abandoned his dying child. "You'll regret this," Richard finally managed to say. "I'll destroy you." But Daniel just smiled sadly. "You already tried that once. I survived. The question is, will you?" He turned to leave but stopped at the door. "I'll be at Carter's Diner tomorrow at noon if you want to talk, to explain, to try to make things right." He looked back at his father. "This is your second chance. Don't waste it like you did your first." With that, Daniel walked out, leaving chaos in his wake. Richard barely made it to his private office before his legs gave out. He collapsed into his chair, loosening his tie as panic set in. Already his phone was exploding with messages. The story was breaking across social media. His carefully crafted image was shattering. Victoria burst into the office, tears streaming down her face. "How could you?" she screamed. "A child, your own son." "You don't understand," Richard tried to explain. "He was dying. I couldn't watch. Don't you dare try to justify this." She yanked her wedding ring off and threw it at him. "I want a divorce. I won't be married to a monster." She stormed out, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts and the growing noise of reporters gathering outside. His lawyer called next. "The press is going crazy," Harold said. "Stock prices are already dropping. We need to get ahead of this." "But how do you get ahead of the truth?" Richard opened his desk drawer and pulled out a bottle of scotch. As he poured a glass with shaking hands, his eyes fell on the morning's newspaper. The headline now seemed to mock him. "Richard Vaughan, the man who has everything." Everything except a conscience, it seemed. His phone rang again. This time it was Sandra, Daniel's mother, his first wife. She was sobbing. "He's alive," she kept saying. "Our baby is alive, and you knew. You lied to me. All those years I grieved, and you knew." Richard hung up. He couldn't handle her pain, just like he couldn't handle it 20 years ago. The night wore on. Richard stayed in his office, watching his empire crumble through news alerts on his phone. Major shareholders were calling for his resignation. Charity boards were distances themselves. Even his country club membership was being reviewed. Around midnight, his sister Elizabeth showed up. She was the only one who'd known the truth all along. "I told you this day would come," she said quietly. "Lies this big don't stay buried forever." Richard stared into his empty glass. "What am I supposed to do?" "For once in your life, brother, try telling the truth." Elizabeth sat down across from him. "That young man didn't come here for revenge. He came looking for his father." "I'm not his father," Richard said bitterly. "I gave up that right." "Then earn it back." Elizabeth stood up. "He's giving you a chance. That's more than you gave him." She left him there, alone with the weight of 2 decades of guilt. Richard pulled up Daniel's medical profile on his computer. His son had become everything Richard had feared he wouldn't be. Strong, successful, alive. While Richard had been building walls to protect himself, Daniel had been breaking down barriers, saving children just like he'd once been. The irony was almost too much to bear. As dawn broke over the city, Richard was still in his office. The photograph Daniel had shown lay on his desk, a moment frozen in time before fear and selfishness had destroyed everything. In the picture, Richard was smiling, holding a laughing Daniel in his arms. They looked happy. They looked like father and son. Richard picked up his phone and called his PR team. "Cancel everything," he said. "Clear my schedule." "Sir, we need to handle this crisis," his publicist protested. "We need to spin the story. No more spin, no more lies." Richard looked at the photograph again. "I'm having lunch with my son today." He hung up before they could argue. For the first time in 20 years, Richard Vaughan was choosing his son over his reputation. Whether Daniel would give him another chance and whether he even deserved one remained to be seen. But as Richard watched the sun rise over the city he'd once ruled, he realized something. He was more afraid of losing his son a second time than he was of losing everything else. Carter's Diner looked exactly like it had for the past 30 years. Red vinyl booths, chrome fixtures, and the smell of coffee in the air. Daniel Chen sat in the last booth watching the door. It was 5 minutes to noon. Martha had tried to come with him. "You don't have to do this alone," she'd said that morning, but Daniel had hugged her and refused. "I've been preparing for this moment for 20 years, Mama. I need to face him on my own." Now, as he waited, Daniel thought about all the questions he'd wanted to ask over the years, all the anger he'd carried, all the pain. The bell above the door chimed. Richard Vaughan walked in, looking nothing like the powerful man from last night's gala. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. He'd aged 10 years overnight. "You came?" Daniel said quietly as Richard slid into the booth across from him. "You didn't think I would?" "Honestly, no." Daniel pushed a coffee cup toward his father. "Black, 2 sugars. You still take it that way?" Richard's hand shook as he reached for the cup. "How did you know?" "I've followed your career, every interview, every article. I wanted to understand the man who could leave his son to die." The words hung between them, heavy with 2 decades of pain. I didn't, Richard started, then stopped. I told myself you wouldn't suffer long, that it was kinder than watching. You die slowly in a hospital bed. I was 4 years old, Daniel said, his voice tight. I was sick and scared, and you left me alone in the dark. A waitress approached their table, but Daniel waved her away. This wasn't a conversation for witnesses. Your mother, Richard said suddenly. Sandra, she's been calling me all night. She wants to see you. I know. She found my office number this morning. We're meeting for dinner tomorrow. Daniel stirred his coffee. She was a victim too, wasn't she? You let her believe I was dead. Richard's face crumpled. I couldn't bear her grief, her constant crying. It was easier to lie, Daniel finished. It's always been easier for you to lie, hasn't it? Yes. The admission seemed to cost Richard physically. I've spent 20 years building a life on that lie. Now it's all falling apart. Good. Richard looked up, startled by the hardness in Daniel's voice. You deserve to lose it all, Daniel continued. Your reputation, your business, your social standing. They're built on the foundation of an abandoned child. Let them crumble. Is that why you came forward? For revenge? No. Daniel pulled out the old photograph again. I came forward because of this picture, because somewhere in here is a man who loved his son. I want to know if that man still exists. Richard stared at the photograph. I was different then, younger, less afraid. Afraid of what? Loving someone. Being vulnerable? Of failing, Richard's voice cracked. Of watching you die despite all my money and power. Of being helpless. So instead, you made sure you failed me completely. Daniel leaned forward. Do you know what happened that night? After you left? Richard shook his head. I woke up alone, scared, crying for my daddy. Daniel's voice was steady, but his hands were clenched. I thought maybe you'd gone to get help. I kept waiting for you to come back. Tears rolled down Richard's cheeks. But you never did, Daniel continued. Instead, God sent me Martha Chen. She worked double shifts at a diner to put me through school. She held my hand through every treatment. She taught me that real strength isn't about running from pain. It's about facing it. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She's my mother, my real parent. Daniel's eyes hardened. The doctors gave me a 30% chance of survival. She made sure I was in the 30%. Richard wiped his eyes. All these years I told myself I did the right thing, that you were better off to her. Don't! Daniel cut him off. Don't you dare try to justify it. You didn't abandon me for my sake. You did it for yours. The truth of it hit Richard like a physical blow. You're right, he whispered. I was a coward. Yes, you were. Daniel took a deep breath. But that's not why I'm here. Why are you here? Because I'm a doctor now. I treat children with cancer, children just like I was, and every day I see parents faced with the same choice you had. Daniel's voice softened slightly. Most of them choose love over fear. They choose to fight no matter how scary it gets. I chose wrong, Richard said. Yes, but now you have another choice to make. Richard looked up. What do you mean? The hospital where I work, where you made your big donation, is starting a new program. We want to provide support for parents of children with cancer. Counseling, resources, hope. Daniel pulled out a folder. We need someone to fund it. You want my money. I want you to help make sure no other parent does what you did. Daniel pushed the folder across the table. It would mean giving up most of your fortune, but maybe it's time your money actually saved some lives. Richard opened the folder with trembling hands. The numbers were astronomical, enough to bankrupt him. Why give me this chance, he asked. Because 20 years ago you chose fear over love. Daniel stood up. I'm giving you the opportunity to make a different choice. He pulled out a business card and placed it on top of the folder. Take some time, think about it. My office number's on the card. Daniel, Richard called as his son turned to leave. I'm sorry, I know it's not enough, but I am so sorry. Daniel paused. You're right, it's not enough, but it's a start. He walked out of the diner, leaving Richard alone with the folder, the business card, and 20 years of regret. Outside, the morning sun was bright. Daniel took a deep breath of fresh air. He'd imagined this confrontation countless times over the years, but the reality was different, harder, messier. His phone buzzed, a text from Martha. "You okay, sweet boy?" Daniel smiled and typed back, "Coming home for dinner, Mama. I love you." Behind him, through the diner window, he could see Richard still sitting in the booth, head in his hands. The mighty Richard Vaughan, brought low by the truth. Now it was up to him to decide. Would he remain the man who abandoned his son? Or would he finally become the father he should have been 20 years ago? The choice was his, just like it had been that night on the dark road. But this time, Daniel wouldn't be the one paying the price. Sandra Mitchell, formerly Sandra Vaughan, paced outside the restaurant where she was supposed to meet her son. Her son, the word still felt unreal. For 20 years, she'd lived with the grief of losing Daniel. She'd visited an empty grave marked with a small angel statue. She'd marked his birthdays with quiet tears. And all this time, he'd been alive. "Mrs. Mitchell?" A hostess appeared at her elbow. "Dr. Chen is already here." Sandra's heart jumped. She followed the hostess through the restaurant, her legs shaking with each step. And then she saw him, sitting at a corner table, looking so much like his father had at that age, that it took her breath away. Daniel stood up when he saw her. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. "You look just like your grandmother," Sandra finally managed to say, her voice breaking. She had those same kind eyes. Without warning, Sandra burst into tears. Daniel quickly moved forward, helping her into a chair. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. I never thought I'd see you again. I thought you were dead. He let me think you were dead." "I know," Daniel said softly, handing her a napkin. "I'm so sorry you went through that." "No." Sandra grabbed his hands. "Don't you dare apologize. You were just a baby, my baby, and I failed you." "You didn't fail me," Daniel assured her. "You were a victim too." A waiter approached but quickly backed away, sensing the intensity of the moment. "Tell me everything," Sandra begged. "Please, I've missed so much." So Daniel told her about Martha Chen, the former nurse who'd found him and saved his life. He told her about growing up in Pennsylvania, about his battle with cancer, about becoming a doctor. "She sounds wonderful," Sandra said when he described Martha. Do you think I could meet her someday?" "She'd like that," Daniel smiled. "She always told me a child can't have too many people loving them." Sandra wiped her eyes. After we lost you, I couldn't stay with Richard. But he was so cold about it all, so distant. Now I know why." Her face hardened. "He watched me grieve for years, watched me fall apart, and he knew the truth the whole time." "Richard will have to live with what he did," Daniel said. "But right now, I want to know about you. What happened after?" Sandra told him about leaving Richard, about moving to Boston, about eventually remarrying. "Tom's a good man," she said. "We have 2 daughters, your half-sisters. Emily is 16 and Rachel is 14. "I have sisters?" Daniel's eyes lit up. "They'd love to meet you. They grew up hearing about their big brother." Sandra squeezed his hand. "I kept your picture on our mantle. Every year on your birthday, we'd light a candle." Just then, Sandra's phone buzzed. It was a news alert. Richard Vaughan was stepping down as CEO of his company. The stock had plummeted 60% since the scandal broke. "He's losing everything," Sandra said, showing Daniel the phone. "Good," a voice said from behind them. They turned to see Victoria, Richard's current wife, or soon-to-be ex-wife, standing there. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Victoria said, "but I had to meet you, Daniel. I had to see the truth for myself." Sandra stood up protectively. "This is a private moment." "It's okay," Daniel said. "Please sit down." Victoria joined them, looking exhausted. "I filed for divorce this morning," she announced. "I couldn't stay married to him after learning what he did. But that's not why I'm here." She pulled out a file from her bag. "Richard has other secrets, other lies. I found these in his private safe." Daniel took the file, opening it carefully. His eyes widened as he read. "He falsified reports," Victoria explained, "covered up safety violations at his factories. 3 workers died last year because of his negligence." "Why are you showing us this?" Sandra asked. "Because the man I married is a monster," Victoria said simply, "and he needs to be stopped before more people get hurt." Daniel stared at the documents, his doctor's mind calculating the human cost of his father's greed. "There's more," Victoria continued. "He's been embezzling money from his own charities, including the Children's Cancer Foundation. Sandra made—" a sound of disgust. "He used our son's illness to steal from sick children." "I'll take these to the authorities," Daniel said quietly, closing the file. "Daniel, no," Sandra protested. "You don't have to get involved. Let someone else handle it." But Daniel shook his head. "I'm already involved. I have been since the night he left me in that car." Victoria stood up. "I'll testify if needed. It's time someone stood up to Richard Vaughan." After she left, Sandra looked at her son with worry. "Are you sure about this? Richard is dangerous when he's cornered." "I'm not afraid of him anymore," Daniel said. "I haven't been since I was that little boy in the hospital fighting to live." Sandra's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "So proud of the man you've become." "I want you to meet my mom, Martha," Daniel said suddenly. "Would you come to dinner tomorrow night? Both of you deserve to know each other." Sandra nodded, unable to speak through her tears. As they finished their lunch, Sandra couldn't stop, staring at her son. Every gesture, every smile was a precious gift she'd thought lost forever. "Daniel," she said as they were leaving, "I know you have another mother, one who raised you and loved you when I couldn't. But is there room in your heart? Could you maybe—" "Yes," Daniel said, hugging her tight. "There's room for both of you." Outside the restaurant, reporters were waiting. The story of the abandoned Vaughan heir was still big news, but Sandra didn't care about the cameras or questions. She had her son back, and this time, she wasn't letting anyone take him away. Martha. Chen's small house was filled with the smell of her famous dumplings. She'd been cooking all day, wanting everything to be perfect for this important dinner. Daniel had offered to host at his apartment, but Martha insisted on doing it here, in the home where she'd raised him. "Mama, relax," Daniel said, watching her check the dumplings for the 10th time. "Everything looks great. I just want her to see that I took good care of you," Martha admitted, smoothing her apron, "that you had a good home." The doorbell rang. Daniel squeezed his mother's hand before going to answer it. Sandra stood on the porch holding a bouquet of flowers. She looked as nervous as Martha felt. "These are for you, Mrs. Chen," Sandra said when Martha came to greet her. I can never thank you enough for what you did for my son. For our son." Martha took the flowers, tears welling in her eyes. "Please, call me Martha. And you don't need to thank me. Loving Daniel has been the greatest gift of my life." The two women stared at each other, these mothers who shared a son in such different ways. Then, without warning, they fell into each other's arms, both, crying. "I thought he was dead," Sandra sobbed. "All these years—" "I know," Martha soothed. "But he's here now, he's safe, he's loved." Daniel watched the scene, his own eyes wet. These two women had shaped his life in such profound ways. One gave him life, the other saved it. Over dinner, Martha brought out photo albums. Sandra gasped at each picture. Daniel's first day of school, science fair victories, graduation, all the moments she'd missed. "He was always so smart," Martha said, proudly, "always wanting to help others." Just like his grandmother, Sandra smiled. She was a nurse too. The peaceful moment was interrupted by Daniel's phone ringing. It was Victoria. "The FBI just raided Richard's offices," she reported. "The documents I gave you, they're moving fast." After he hung up, Daniel explained the situation to his mothers. "That man," Martha said, shaking her head. "First he abandons his sick child, then he steals from other sick children. There's a special place in hell." "Martha!" Sandra looked shocked, then started laughing. Soon all three of them were laughing, the tension broken, but the laughter died. When the news alert came through on their phones, Richard Vaughan had disappeared. His private jet had left the country hours before the FBI raid. "Coward," Sandra spat. "Running away again. It's what he does best." "He won't get far," Daniel said quietly. "Not this time." Martha reached for his hand. "Sweet boy, maybe it's better if he's gone. You can move on with your life." But Sandra saw the look in her son's eyes, the same determination she'd seen in the mirror all those years ago when she was fighting to survive losing him. "He needs to face what he's done," Sandra said. All of it. Martha nodded slowly. You're right. No more running, no more lies. Daniel's phone rang again. This time it was Elizabeth, Richard's sister. I know where he's going, she said without preamble. He has a villa in the Cayman Islands. No extradition. Why are you telling me this? Daniel asked. Because I'm tired of watching my brother destroy lives, Elizabeth replied. He needs help, Daniel, real help. And maybe you're the only one who can make him face himself. After hanging up, Daniel looked at his mothers. I have to go after him. No, both women said simultaneously. I'll call the FBI, Sandra insisted. Let them handle it. By then he'll be gone, Daniel argued. This might be our only chance. Martha stood up, her face set. Then I'm coming with you. Mama, no, don't Mama know me, Martha said firmly. I didn't save you from death just to let you face that man alone. I'm coming too, Sandra declared. It's time I faced him as, well. Daniel looked between his two mothers. One who'd given him life, one who'd saved it. Both ready to fight for him just as they always had. Okay, he said finally. We'll go together. Within an hour, they were packed and ready. Martha insisted on bringing food. Airline food is terrible, while Sandra called in favors to get last-minute flight arrangements. As they drove to the airport, Daniel thought about the little boy he'd once been, alone and afraid in a dark car. He wasn't alone anymore. He had two mothers who loved him, friends who supported him, and a strength that Richard had never understood. We'll probably miss him, Sandra said worriedly. The Caymans are big. No, Martha said with quiet confidence. God didn't bring my boy back to life just to let his father escape justice. Daniel smiled at his mothers in the rearview mirror. Whatever happened in the Cayman Islands, he knew one thing for certain. He was the luckiest son in the world. But first, they had to catch a coward. The night sky was clear as their plane took off, carrying them toward a confrontation 20 years in the making. Somewhere ahead of them, Richard Vaughan was running from his past, but his past was finally catching up to him, and this time, it had two angry mothers on its side. The Cayman Islands lived up to their reputation as paradise. Crystal blue waters stretched to the horizon, palm trees swayed in the warm breeze, and luxury yachts dotted the harbor. But Daniel Chen wasn't here for the scenery. Richard's villa is in South Sound, Sandra said, checking her phone as they left the airport. Elizabeth sent me the address. Martha wiped sweat from her forehead. It's so hot here, no wonder rich people hide their money in paradise. Nobody wants to chase them in this heat. They'd barely checked into their hotel when Victoria called with news. The FBI found evidence of more crimes, she reported. He wasn't just stealing from the cancer charity. He was using it to launder money for drug cartels. Daniel's hand tightened on the phone. How many lives has he destroyed? There's more, Victoria continued. I found old emails. He's been paying people to keep quiet about the night he abandoned you. The police officer who took the stolen car report, the hospital administrator who didn't push for an investigation, he bought their silence. Martha muttered something in Chinese that didn't sound very charitable. The FBI agent in charge wants to talk to you, Victoria added. They're building a case for attempted murder. After hanging up, Daniel stood at the hotel window staring at the perfect blue ocean. All these years I thought he just got scared, that he was weak. But this is evil. Sandra touched his arm. You don't have to confront him. We can call the authorities. No. Daniel turned to face his mothers. I need to look him in the eye one last time. I need him to know that he failed. They took a taxi to South Sound, where massive villas lined private beaches. Richard's house stood apart from the others, a modern fortress of glass and steel surrounded by high walls. Look, Martha pointed to fresh tire tracks at the gate. Someone's here. They found the gate unlocked. Another sign Richard had arrived, in a hurry. As they walked up the long driveway, Daniel's heart pounded. 20 years of questions were about to be answered. The front door was also unlocked. They entered quietly, following the sound of movement to a huge living room overlooking the ocean. Richard Vaughan stood at a wall safe, frantically shoving papers and cash into a briefcase. He looked smaller somehow, desperate, nothing like the powerful man who terrorized Daniel's memories. Going somewhere, Father? Richard spun around. When he saw Daniel standing there with Martha and Sandra, all the color drained from his face. "How did you find me? You're not as clever as you think," Sandra said, her voice cold. "You never were." Richard's eyes darted between them like a trapped animal looking for escape. "You don't understand. I can explain everything." "Explain." "What?" Martha stepped forward, her usual gentleness replaced by steel. "Explain how you left a sick child to die. How you let his mother grieve for 20 years. How you stole from other sick children." "I had my reasons," Richard shouted. "The company was in trouble. I needed money. And Daniel was going to die anyway. I couldn't watch that happen. I couldn't be weak." "Weak?" Daniel's quiet voice cut through his father's ranting. "You think love makes you weak? Look at you now," Sandra added, "running away with stolen money. Is this your idea of strength?" Richard slumped against the wall. "What do you want from me?" "The truth," Daniel said. "All of it, starting with that night." For a moment it looked like Richard might refuse. Then, like a dam breaking, the words poured out. "I was losing everything," he said. "The company was failing. The banks were calling in loans. Then you got sick and the medical bills, and I couldn't handle it. Couldn't handle watching you suffer. Couldn't handle being helpless. So you made sure you'd never have to help anyone," Martha said. "You chose money over your own child." "Yes," Richard whispered. "And once I started running, I couldn't stop. One lie led to another. The charity was supposed to make up for it somehow, but then I needed more money. To cover up what you did to me," Daniel finished. Richard nodded miserably. "I told myself you were better off dead than having me for a father. But really, I was the one better off pretending you were dead." Suddenly, the sound of helicopters filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed outside. "FBI," a voice boomed through a megaphone. "The house is surrounded." Richard lunged for his briefcase, but Daniel stepped in his way. "Move," Richard growled. "I won't let you stop me." "Like you wouldn't let cancer stop me." Daniel didn't budge. "I was 4 years old, and I fought harder than you've ever fought in your life." Martha moved to Daniel's side. "I found him in that car burning with fever, crying for his daddy. But God had a different plan. I grieved for 20 years, Sandra added, joining them. "But my son survived. He became a better man than you could ever be." Richard looked between the three of them. The son he'd abandoned, the woman who'd saved him, and the wife he'd betrayed. In their faces, he saw all his failures, all his crimes, all his cowardice. The FBI was breaking down the door now. In seconds, they'd be here. "It's over, Father," Daniel said softly. "No more running." Richard's shoulders sagged. The briefcase fell from his hands, spilling stolen money across the floor. As the FBI agents swarmed in, Richard Vaughan finally stopped running. They led him away in handcuffs, past the son he'd failed to kill and the two mothers who'd shown more strength than he'd ever possessed. Outside, the paradise of the Cayman Islands continued unchanged. The ocean sparkled, the palm trees swayed, the yachts bobbed in the harbor. But for Daniel Chen, standing between his two mothers, watching his father being led away, a different kind of peace settled over him. "Let's go home," he said. Martha squeezed his hand. "Yes, I need to make you both a proper dinner. Nobody can think straight on airplane food." Sandra laughed through her tears. "I'd like that." As they walked away from the villa, Daniel looked back one last time. Richard was in the back of an FBI vehicle, his head bowed. The mighty Richard Vaughan had finally fallen. But Daniel Chen had risen, supported by love, strengthened by truth, and blessed with not one but two mothers who'd never stopped fighting for him. Paradise, he realized, wasn't a place you ran to. It was the people who stood beside you no matter what. The federal courthouse was packed the day of Richard Vaughan's sentencing. Reporters filled every available seat, their cameras ready to capture the fall of one of America's most notorious businessmen. Daniel sat between Martha and Sandra in the front row. Behind them sat Victoria, Elizabeth, and a group of parents whose children had been affected by Richard's charity fraud. Richard looked small in his orange jumpsuit, nothing like the powerful man who'd once commanded boardrooms. His lawyer had advised him to plead guilty to all charges, hoping for leniency. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Patricia Martinez, read through the list of crimes: attempted murder, fraud, money laundering, embezzlement, Conspiracy. Mr. Vaughan, Judge Martinez said, "Before I pass sentence, do you have anything to say to the court?" Richard stood slowly. For the first time since his arrest, he turned to face his son. "I've spent 2 months in jail thinking about that night," he said, his voice shaking. "About the little boy I left in that car. About all the lives I've destroyed. Trying to cover up what I did." He paused, wiping his eyes. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want my son to know I was wrong about everything." The judge nodded. "Mr. Vaughan, your crimes spanned decades. You abandoned your gravely ill child, leaving him to die. You let his mother believe he was dead. You stole from charities meant to help children like the son you abandoned. The court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison." The gavel came down with finality. As the bailiffs led Richard away, he looked one last time at Daniel. In his eyes was something his son had never seen before: remorse. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them. "Dr. Chen, how do you feel about the sentence?" "Mrs. Vaughan, did you know about your husband's crimes?" "Mrs. Chen, what's it like sharing your son with his birth mother?" Martha stepped forward, surprising everyone. "My son was saved by love," she said firmly. "Not just my love, but God's love. Now he has 2 mothers, twice the love. That's all any of you need to know." Back at Martha's house, where they'd gathered for dinner, Sandra helped set the table while Daniel and Martha cooked. "The hospital board approved our new program," Daniel announced, stirring the sauce Martha had taught him to make years ago. "We're calling it the Second Chance Foundation. It'll provide support for families dealing with childhood cancer." "And Richard's money will fund it?" Sandra asked. Daniel nodded. "Everything he stole plus most of his legitimate assets. The court ordered full restitution." "Good," Martha said. "At least some good will come from all this." The doorbell rang. It was Victoria and Elizabeth, carrying wine and dessert. "Hope we're not intruding," Elizabeth said hesitantly, "but we wanted to talk about the foundation." "Your family," Martha said, taking their coats. "Family's never an intrusion." Over dinner, they discussed plans for the foundation. Victoria, with her business experience, offered to help manage it. Elizabeth wanted to reach out to her society connections for additional support. "I've been thinking," Sandra said suddenly. "What if we expanded the program? Not just medical support, but legal aid too, to help families fight insurance companies and employers." "That's brilliant," Daniel smiled. "We could help families stay together during the hardest times of their lives." "Unlike some people we know," Martha muttered, then quickly added, "Pass. The potatoes, please." Everyone laughed, the tension broken. They were an odd family. 2 mothers, an ex-wife, a sister-in-law, and the son who'd brought them all together. But somehow it worked. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Daniel found Martha looking at old photos. "Remember this?" she asked, pointing to a picture of young Daniel in a science fair. "You were so proud of that project. You worked double shifts to buy me that chemistry set," Daniel remembered. "I never thanked you properly for all the sacrifices." "Loving you was never a sacrifice," Martha said softly. "Having Sandra in our lives now, that's not a sacrifice either. Love multiplies, it doesn't divide." Daniel hugged her tight. "You taught me that, Mama. You taught me everything important." His phone buzzed. A text from Sandra. "Emily and Rachel are so excited to meet their big brother this weekend. They've been asking a million questions." Daniel smiled, showing Martha the message. "Ready to be a grandmother to 2 teenage girls? Or, no kidding, I've already started knitting them sweaters." Martha's eyes twinkled. "Though they might be a bit warm for summer, they'll love them anyway," Daniel assured her. "Just like I love your yearly Christmas sweaters. Even the one with the light-up reindeer nose, especially that one." They sat together, looking through more photos. Daniel's graduation from A medical school, his first day as a doctor, recent pictures with Sandra and his half-sisters. A life built on love, not abandoned in fear. "I got a letter from Richard today," Daniel said quietly. "He wants to see me." Martha set down the photo album. "Are you going to go?" "I don't know." Daniel stared out the window. "Part of me wants to understand him better. Part of me thinks it's too late. Only you can make that choice," Martha said. "But remember, forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about letting go of the pain, so it doesn't control you anymore." Daniel thought about the little boy he'd been. waiting in that dark car for a father who never came back. He thought about the man he'd become, surrounded by more love than Richard could ever understand. Maybe someday, he said, but not yet. Right now I want to focus on the family I have, the family that chose love over fear. Martha squeezed his hand. Then that's what we'll do. Together. Outside, the stars were coming out. The same stars that had watched over a scared little boy 20 years ago. But that boy wasn't alone anymore. He had 2 mothers, 2 sisters, and an extended family built not from obligation, but from choice. Richard Vaughan had chosen money over love, fear over faith, running over standing strong. In doing so, he'd lost everything that mattered. But his greatest mistake had led to something beautiful, a family bound together not by blood but by love, a love that had turned tragedy into triumph, abandonment into belonging, and fear into faith. Sometimes, Martha thought, watching her son smile, at a photo of his sisters, God's greatest gifts come disguised as our deepest wounds. You just have to be strong enough to let love heal them. Emily and Rachel Mitchell stood nervously in front of Daniel's apartment building, clutching their mother's hands. At 16 and 14, they'd grown up hearing stories about their long-lost brother. Now they were about to meet him. What if he doesn't like us? Rachel whispered to Sandra. He already loves you, Sandra assured her. He's been asking about you both every day. The elevator ride to the 10th floor felt endless. When they reached Daniel's door, it opened before they could knock. Martha Chen stood there, wearing an apron and a warm smile. Come in, she said. I hope everyone likes lasagna. The girls hesitated for just a moment before Martha pulled them both into a hug. My granddaughters, she said, her eyes shining. I've been waiting to meet you. Daniel appeared from the kitchen, looking almost as nervous as his sisters. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Emily broke the silence. You look just like the picture Mom keeps on the mantel, she said, except older and taller. Everyone laughed, and just like that, the tension broke. Over dinner, the girls couldn't stop asking questions. They wanted to know everything about their big brother, his favorite books, his work at the hospital, what he was like as a kid. Show them the science fair photo, Martha said, bringing out the familiar album. Mama, not the embarrassing pictures, Daniel protested, but he was smiling. You won science fairs too? Rachel perked up. I just won first place at my school. Really? Daniel leaned forward. What was your project? The effects of different types of music on plant growth, Rachel said proudly. The plants that listened to classical music grew the best. That's amazing. Daniel turned to Emily. What about you? What are you interested in? Emily bit her lip. Actually, I want to be a doctor, like you. Is that weird? Weird, it's perfect. Daniel's face lit up. Want to come see the hospital sometime? I could show you around. Both girls nodded eagerly. Sandra watched her children bonding, tears in her eyes. Martha squeezed her hand, understanding without words. Later that night, after Sandra had taken the girls home with promises of weekly family dinners, Daniel and Martha cleaned up. They're wonderful, Martha said. Rachel has your curiosity, and Emily, she reminds me so much of you at that age. I can't believe I have sisters, Daniel said softly. All those years of being alone, and now. The next morning brought another big moment, the official launch of the Second Chance Foundation. They'd chosen to hold it at St. Luke's Hospital, where Daniel worked and where Martha had once been a nurse. The hospital auditorium was packed. Victoria had handled the press, making sure every major network was there. Elizabeth had brought her. Society friends all eager to support the cause. Sandra sat in the front row with Emily and Rachel, who wore matching Second Chance Foundation t-shirts. Martha stood backstage with Daniel, adjusting his tie like she'd done since his first job interview. Ready? She asked. Daniel looked out at the crowd. I've been ready for 20 years. He walked onto the stage, and the room fell silent. 20 years ago, he began, a father left his sick child to die. That child was me. But God had other plans. He sent me an angel named Martha Chen, who taught me that real strength comes from love, not fear. In the audience, Emily grabbed Rachel's hand. Today we're launching the Second Chance Foundation, Daniel continued. Not just to help families fighting childhood cancer, but to make sure no parent ever feels so alone, so desperate, that abandonment seems like the only choice. He outlined the foundation's programs: medical support, legal aid, counseling services, even housing assistance for families who needed to relocate for treatment. "And I'm proud to announce our first major initiative," he said, smiling at his sisters. "The Emily and Rachel Mitchell Scholarship Fund for siblings of childhood cancer patients who want to pursue medical careers." Emily burst into tears. Rachel hugged her tight. "Because cancer doesn't just affect the sick child," Daniel explained. "It affects the whole family, and families deserve to stay together, to grow stronger together." After the presentation, as people mingled at the reception, a nurse approached Daniel. "Dr. Chen, there's a little girl in the oncology ward who heard you were here. She's asking to meet you." Daniel looked at his family. Martha and Sandra deep in conversation, Victoria and Elizabeth discussing fundraising plans, Emily and Rachel showing off their scholarship fund brochures. "I'll be right back," he told them. The little girl's name was Lucy. She was 4 years old, the same age Daniel had been when Richard abandoned him. She was fighting leukemia, and she was scared. "I heard you were sick like me when you were little," she said. Daniel sat beside her bed. "I was. And you? Know what? I was scared too, but I had people who loved me, who fought for me, just like you do." Lucy's parents stood nearby, exhausted but determined. Daniel saw in their eyes what Richard had lacked, the strength to face fear with love. "Would you like to hear a story?" he asked Lucy. "About a little boy who got sick, but found out that love is stronger than any illness." Lucy nodded, settling back against her pillows. As Daniel began to tell his story, their story, Martha appeared in the doorway. She watched her son with proud tears in her eyes, remembering the sick little boy who'd become this compassionate doctor. Sandra joined her, followed by Emily and Rachel. They all watched as Daniel sat with Lucy, sharing not just his story, but the hope that had brought their family together. "Love really does multiply," Martha whispered. Sandra nodded. "It really does." Outside Lucy's room, the Second Chance Foundation banner hung in the hospital corridor. Below it, someone had added a simple quote: "Sometimes the worst moments in our lives lead us to the best people in our lives." Daniel looked up from Lucy's bedside and saw his family, all of them brought together by a tragedy that had become a blessing. Sometimes second chances came in ways you never expected. Sometimes they came with two mothers, two sisters, and a love strong enough to heal any wound, even the wounds of a little boy left alone in the dark. 1 year after the launch of the Second Chance Foundation, Martha Chen's backyard was filled with laughter. It was Thanksgiving, and the family had grown larger than anyone could have imagined. Emily and Rachel were helping Martha in the kitchen, learning the secret to her famous dumplings. Sandra and Victoria were setting up tables in the yard, while Elizabeth arranged flowers she'd brought from her garden. Daniel watched them all from the porch, thinking about how much had changed in the past year. The foundation had helped over 200 families so far. Emily had started volunteering at the hospital, more certain than ever about becoming a doctor. Rachel's new science project, studying the psychological effects of support groups on cancer patients' siblings, had won state championships. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Martha asked, joining him on the porch. "Just thinking about family," Daniel said, "and how sometimes the worst decisions can lead to the best outcomes." Martha nodded, understanding. "Have you decided about Richard's latest letter?" Richard had been writing monthly from prison. His last letter had asked permission to donate his entire fortune to the foundation. "I'm going to visit him next week," Daniel said quietly. "Not to forgive him, but to thank him." "Thank him?" Martha looked surprised. "If he hadn't left me in that car, you wouldn't have found me. I wouldn't have my sisters or Victoria and Elizabeth in our lives. The foundation wouldn't exist." Daniel smiled. His worst act led to so much good. Inside the house, the phone rang. It was Lucy's mother calling. Lucy was officially in remission. Her family had been one of the first the foundation helped, and now they were volunteers helping other families navigate the same journey. "Dr. Chen!" Lucy herself came on the line. "Guess what? I got an A on my science project. I want to be a doctor like you when I grow up." After the call, Daniel found Sandra in the kitchen, wiping tears. "Happy tears," she assured him. "I was just thinking about that first Thanksgiving after we lost you. How empty everything felt." She hugged him, tight. "Now look at us, look at all of this." The doorbell rang, more guests arriving. Families the foundation had helped, colleagues from the hospital, even some of Richard's former business partners who'd chosen to support the foundation's work. Martha's small backyard was soon filled with people, food, and story sharing. Children who'd beaten cancer played with their siblings. Parents who'd once felt hopeless now offered hope to others. It was everything the foundation stood for. Family, support, second chances. Emily called everyone to attention by tapping her glass with a spoon. "Rachel and I have an announcement," she said. "We've decided to start a youth advisory board for the foundation. Because sometimes kids understand what other kids need better than adults do." The idea was met with enthusiastic approval. Daniel watched his sisters beam with pride, remembering how nervous they'd been at their first meeting just a year ago. As the sun began to set, Martha brought out her camera. Time for the family photo. Everyone gathered together, not just the immediate family, but all the extended members of their growing circle. Martha set the timer and hurried to join them. "Wait," Daniel said suddenly. He pulled out an old photograph from his wallet, the same one he'd shown Richard at the gala. The picture of a father and son, taken before fear had torn them apart. He placed it on a small table near the group. "For remembrance," he explained, "of where we started and how far we've come." Martha nodded approvingly. "The past is part of our story too." The camera flashed, capturing the moment. A family built not from obligation but choice, bound together by love that had grown from life's deepest wounds. Later that night, after the guests had gone home, Daniel found his mothers sitting together on the porch swing, looking at the stars. "Remember that first night?" Martha asked Sandra. "When you came to meet me, we were both so nervous." "Now look at us," Sandra laughed, "co-grandmothers to half the kids in the foundation." Daniel sat between them, just like he had so many times over the past year. "I've been thinking about writing a book," he said, "about our story." "The whole story?" Martha asked. Daniel nodded. "From that night, on the road to now. About how fear can destroy a family, but love can build a bigger one from the pieces." "People need to hear that," Sandra said softly. "Need to know that it's never too late for a second chance." As if on cue, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. Another family had just been referred to the foundation. A single mother with 2 kids, one fighting brain cancer. "I'll head to the hospital first thing tomorrow," Daniel said. "We'll come too," Martha decided. "These families need to know they're not alone." "Never alone," Sandra agreed. Daniel looked at his mothers, the one who gave him life and the one who saved it. He thought about his sisters, about Lucy, about all the families the foundation had helped. He thought about Richard, alone in his prison cell, finally understanding what real strength looked like. 20 years ago, a father had left his son to die choosing fear over love. But love had won anyway. Love had built something fear could never destroy, a family that chose each other every day, through every challenge. Martha always said God works in mysterious ways. Maybe she was right. Maybe sometimes the darkest roads lead to the brightest destinations. Maybe sometimes it takes being abandoned to learn the true meaning of belonging. The stars twinkled overhead, the same stars that had watched over a scared little boy in a dark car, the same stars that now watched over countless families finding hope through the foundation. Daniel Chen had been left behind, but he'd never been alone. Not really. Not when love had been waiting to find him, to save him, to show him that family isn't just about blood, it's about choice. And every day, he chose love. Every day, love chose him back. The end.